Ask New Brunswickers what they think about the political process, and many will complain about MLA pensions, political perks, and a tone-deaf legislative system. So last fall, Premier David Alward asked an eminent political scientist to look at improving the political process to deal with voter frustrations and to give more voice to third parties in this province. Well, today, UNB's Don Desaroud tabled his report and recommendations on legislative reform. He joins me now from Fredericton. So, Don Desaroud, what would you describe as the greatest frustration that voters and participants have with the way things operate now?
I think a lot of voters believe, and with some evidence, that once they elect their MLAs disappear into this complex machine of legislative government. They're in committees, perhaps, or they're speaking in the legislature, but they're cut off from their constituents. They're not responding anymore. And more to the point, that they're being manipulated and controlled by party machines, which have more influence over their voting than their own constituents would have.
So MLAs get elected, they disappear into the political machine, and the public don't see any way to affect the work that they do. Now, in your report, I have it here, a great document, you recommend several changes. You recommend opening up legislative committees, you recommend improvements to question period, among many other things. But isn't all of that just really tinkering with the system when what people really seem to want is wider electoral reform?
To a certain extent, I think you're right. I think there's a reform that can be made within the system. There's advantages to doing that because those reforms are possible, they're doable, they can be done without a lot of extra expense. But if the tone or if the sentiment of the public of New Brunswick is for something more substantial, the problem with that is that we're not really sure exactly what that is yet. And something that we do raise in this report, everyone that we spoke to did start off the conversation with a question of electoral reform. Now, some said, we think the system is fine the way it is. Yeah. Others said, no, we need to change it. But there's not a consensus yet of exactly what that change should be. But I think we need to move in that direction, and that's the conversation we need to be having now.
There is a sense, though, of the need for much broader reform in terms of how we elect our representatives and who they represent. And one of the suggestions is proportional representation. Not a suggestion you're making in this report, but that is one of the things being debated.
Yeah, and from my own standpoint, I think that's a strong step. It's a step in the right direction. Yeah. Probably more of a hybrid system that combines these constituency-based MLAs with some that are added on a proportional basis. But that's a really good point, because when people talk about electoral reform, that's immediately what comes to mind, PR, as they will say. There are so many other systems and other models out there, other examples that we could be studying and looking at that we haven't really explored yet and are not part of the debate yet. I mean, we talked about a preferential ballot in our report as another model. That's something I don't think the public has really had a chance to get their head around either. So we're quite a ways away from finding a consensus on exactly what kind of reform the electoral system that we want should be and how it should proceed. I definitely think, though, that, and I hope this report will do, is further that conversation. We need to start, the next step is to start talking about exactly that. So
what does need to happen next? You've made some basic recommendations to the Premier. What's the next step?
Well, we have had a Commission on Legislative Democracy in New Brunswick that did an excellent job, a very detailed report. Probably some of the reforms, particularly on electoral reform, were too complicated to make them palatable to the public. So I think what we need to do is get back to that report, have a look at it. But I want those legislative committees, which were front and center in our report, to do the heavy lifting on this matter. So perhaps what the government would like to do, or the legislature would like to do, more to the point, is strike a committee that can re-examine those recommendations and then start a public process, hold public hearings, travel the province, and actually look at these issues.
What is the outlook for you then, and for voters in this province, if this document you've compiled goes the route of the former one done for the Lord government and just gets shelved? What does the future hold?
Well, I think that the enthusiasm, the pressure, the desire for change is getting stronger and stronger. It's not just here in New Brunswick; it's across the province. I know that there's been efforts to try to change things in other jurisdictions that have failed, but I think the day is coming and the time is coming that these will become inevitable, and they will have to happen. So governments will have to respond, and each government seems to be getting that step closer. So I'm optimistic that we will be able to move this along in some way anyway.
All right, Don Desirud, good talking to you. Thank you for your time today.
You're welcome.
Don Desirud is a political scientist from UNB St. John and the author of Proposals for Legislative Reform in New Brunswick.